Hello, 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 everybody. Hello, hello, hello. Going to give people just a couple seconds to sign on here, and then we are going to get started. All right, welcome back to Climate Voters Tonight. We've been on a bit of a summer break with the 4th of July holiday week and my own vacation where I was able to recharge my batteries. As always, I'm your host, Peter Schleisman, and we have got an excellent program for you tonight. First, we're going to talk to Doug Lindner from the League of Conservation Voters about voting rights, how democracy is connected to environmental progress, and 2 important Supreme Court decisions. I promise we won't get too in the weeds, though. Then we're going to turn to the Environmental Protection Agency's recently proposed carbon pollution standards for new and existing power plants. And yes, don't worry, we will give you the tools you need to let the agency hear directly from you. And last, we'll show a quick recap of a virtual event that we held, which showcased how you can take advantage of the tax credits and rebates from President Biden's clean energy plan. But first, the headlines. There's been a climate leadership shakeup out west amid a scorching heat wave. Nevada just backtracked on its climate targets, while Arizona committed to climate action. But why does this matter? All right, 2 reasons. First, states are a laboratory where ideas can be tested and the promising ones can be expanded at the federal level. Second, we need our states to meet their climate action plans. That means meeting their emission reductions targets in order to meet our national goals. In fact, a new analysis from EDF shows that leadership states, 24 states with climate commitments, can play a major role in driving national progress if they follow through on their promises. This is why elections matter so much. Here at EDF Action, we're going to continue to go all in for climate champions, and we'll continue to need your help. The Biden administration has announced big investments to plug orphan wells. Last week, the Department of the Interior announced over $650 million in bipartisan infrastructure law funding dedicated to plugging abandoned oil and gas wells in 27 states. Orphan wells have health and safety hazards and can drive climate change due to methane leaks. This funding is a step in the right direction to clean up abandoned oil and gas industry sites and protect public health. A major company will retire all its coal power plants. Last Monday, DTE Energy made a big announcement. They will be retiring coal plants by 2032 and investing $11 billion in clean energy. The Detroit-based company is committed to working with other organizations in Michigan to develop solar and wind energy over the next 10 years. This big announcement comes at exactly the right time as the EPA is considering cracking down on greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector. But more on that later. EDF Action is looking for climate activists to write letters to the editor for their local papers. Throughout this summer, we're hoping to spread awareness of critical climate and clean energy issues in newspapers nationwide. The deadline to join our Letters for Climate campaign has passed, but don't worry. Committed activists still have the chance to sign up as long as you do so today. So join us today and get started on writing and submitting an LTE focused on climate and clean energy. Join by signing up at the link you'll find on the screen and in the comments. All right, next Friday, July 28th at noon Eastern Daylight Time, we at EDF Action are going to try something new. We're hosting an event to help give you some sustainable summer tips. We know how hard you advocate for climate progress, whether it's for businesses to be more sustainable or our government to take action. We can always count on you. But are you interested in learning some simple, practical tips to be more climate conscious in your own day-to-day life? I know I want to take action in my life, but it can feel daunting and overwhelming. Well, that's why we're putting on this event to help break down these barriers to make personal action easier while never losing sight of the fact that, of course, we need to keep advocating for big, bold change at the state, national, and business level. Sign up to join us at the link in the comments. All right, now I would love to introduce Doug Lindner to the program. He is LCV's Senior Director of Democracy. Hey, Doug, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Peter. Great to be here.
Awesome. So let's just jump right into the interview. Real quick. All right. So why does voting access in elections matter for climate action in the first place?
It matters quite a bit, and it matters for a few reasons. First of all, democracy a healthy democracy is the only way to protect a healthy environment, because the opponents of a healthy environment are very powerful special interests. The fossil fuel industry in particular is one of the wealthiest, most politically influential special interests in the nation and in the world. And they have a very sophisticated influence apparatus through traditional campaign finance, through new campaign finance tools that have come up since Citizens United, through their efforts to fund all kinds of think tanks and university centers and other ways to try to influence our system, including all three branches of government, every level of government, federal, state, and local. And so it's super important that the people who want clean air, clean water, and a sustainable future have our voices heard, and that every voter is equal, no matter how much money you have, or where you live, or your ethnic background, or anything else. And also really important to keep in mind that threats to voting rights, threats to access to the ballot box, and threats to environmental justice often affect the same communities. Communities of color and other historically marginalized groups bear the greatest burden of both voter suppression and environmental injustice. And so it's incredibly important to ensure that we are getting everyone into the political process, that everyone is able to participate in our democracy and to protect their own and their own community's interests from these powerful polluters.
Right. Always important to remember that these issues, voting rights, environmental justice, these things do overlap. Neither takes place in a bubble. So, speaking about that, can you talk about the types of voting rights cases that are currently being taken up by the court?
Yeah. So over the last decade, especially since a 2013 case called Shelby County v. Holder, which substantially weakened and narrowed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Supreme Court has established a pattern of taking on cases that threaten the future of voting rights protections. And this is a very scary thing. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 has often been called the most effective civil rights law ever passed in the United States. And this is not the only piece of our voting rights puzzle, but it is the most important one for the moment. And we've seen the court, not just in that 2013 case, but in cases since, and especially as they have lurched even further to the right since 2013, there are a lot of threats. And it's worth keeping in mind that the Supreme Court, in addition to deciding how they will rule in cases, the Supreme Court decides what cases they want to hear and what questions they want to consider in those cases. And so when they have an agenda they want to pursue, there is a lot of harm that can be done. And so we are seeing voting rights protections be rolled back. We are seeing protections against gerrymandering and campaign finance taken away. And we are seeing it become more and more difficult for the people to resist efforts by powerful special interests and partisan extremists to take power for themselves, as opposed to having that power in the hands of everyone where it belongs.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So now I'd like to turn to this North Carolina-based Supreme Court decision. Can you quickly talk about what the premise of that case was and what was the outcome?
Yeah, so that was one of two major democracy cases that was at the Supreme Court over the court's last term. And for context, the Supreme Court works on kind of a school year term. Most of their big cases happen between October and June. So we got two big decisions in June. Moore v. Harper is the North Carolina case. And this is one that our state affiliate, North Carolina LCV, was heavily involved in that case and a party to it. This is a case in which the North Carolina legislature, which is itself quite gerrymandered, had passed a congressional map after the 2020 census back in 2021. They passed a new congressional map that was also going to be very gerrymandered. And so voters and organizations like North Carolina LCV challenged that map and said this is too gerrymandered, and they challenged it in the North Carolina state courts. And the North Carolina State Supreme Court said, plaintiffs, you're right, this map is too gerrymandered, it's got to go, it violates the state constitution. And then the North Carolina legislators, the ones who had created this gerrymandered map, ran to the only court above the state Supreme Court, which is the United States Supreme Court. And they went to the United States Supreme Court with an ask to try to overturn that state Supreme Court decision and say that the partisan gerrymandered map could go into effect. And they did this with a crackpot legal theory called the independent state legislature theory. This is a theory that is unprecedented. The court had never really considered it before. It comes from the fringes. And the idea is that state legislatures should be, under this theory, should be able to essentially ignore their state courts and their state constitutions in setting rules, including district maps for federal elections. And that's a very scary thing because, like North Carolina, many states have highly gerrymandered state legislatures, and we need those checks and balances to ensure that when legislatures are themselves undermining democracy, that there are other institutions, especially the courts, using those state constitutions to be able to protect democracy from those legislatures. By the way, especially when you have the US Supreme Court weakening federal protections for voting rights. So you can't have also state protections be weakened. So the US Supreme Court decided to take this case and hear it, and they considered the independent state legislature doctrine. They considered allowing state legislatures that are gerrymandered, like the one in North Carolina, to ignore their state courts and state constitutions in setting federal election rules. And in this case, in the decision they made, they decided to not do that this time. There has been further action with the North Carolina Supreme Court that is outside the scope of the US Supreme Court ruling, but the big picture for national policy here is they have not upheld the independent state legislature theory for now. But even though the Supreme Court took this opportunity to do a bad thing and then took a pass on doing the bad thing for now, they did open the door for future uses of theories like this for other situations that they might think, not this time. We're not going to bring it up now, but we're going to keep this power for ourselves in case we want to use it down the road. And so it's good that they didn't do the bad thing in this case this time, but it's scary for what is coming down the road or what may come down the road.
Interesting. That's a great explanation of it. Also slightly terrifying one, but it's a good thing for us to be aware of and keep our eye on. So moving on just a little bit, this, although it was a huge case on voting rights this year, was not the only one. Can you talk about the Alabama redistricting case and what the outcome was in that case?
Yes. So this case, the Alabama case, is called Allen v. Milligan. Used to be called Merrill v. Milligan. They changed the name. Now it's Allen v. Milligan. And this is one similar to the North Carolina case. It's one in which a state legislature that is itself highly gerrymandered produced a gerrymandered map for congressional districts in that state. So Moore v. Harper we just talked about was North Carolina. This one is Alabama. And in this case, the question was about whether the Alabama congressional map violated the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965 by being a racist gerrymander. And in particular, it's about whether Alabama should have one black majority congressional district or two. The Alabama legislature, which is dominated by white conservatives, wanted to have one black majority congressional district to have more of the other side. And of course, the plaintiffs and those trying to vindicate voting rights were trying to have two. Mm-hmm. So it went to the Supreme. So this first went to a lower federal court back in 2022. And the lower federal court looked at this map and they considered it very seriously. And the lower federal court decided the plaintiffs are right. This is a racist gerrymander. It violates the Voting Rights Act. It should not go into effect. And the lower court said, Alabama, you cannot use this map for the 2022 midterm. And then the state of Alabama ran to the US Supreme Court and said, US Supreme Court, let us use our racist gerrymander. And so the US Supreme Court did two things. First, they said, Alabama, go ahead and use your gerrymander for the 2022 midterm. And so they did. They used that map with only one black majority congressional district in Alabama for the 2022 midterm. Mm-hmm. But the court also said that that's for this time, that's for this midterm. But they said, let's take up the case and have a full briefing, an oral argument, and a full decision on this over the course of the next year. And so while that happened, while that 2022 midterm happened under the old map that the lower court said was a racist gerrymander, the Supreme Court was considering this case and considering further weakening the Federal Voting Rights Act for arguably the third time in the last decade, maybe more than that. And back in June of this year, last month, they came out with a decision in Allen v. Milligan in which the Supreme Court, like in the other case, took a pass on doing the bad thing. So even though they had allowed the racist gerrymander in Alabama to go into effect for the 2022 midterm, the court now narrowly decided that actually that map does violate the Voting Rights Act and must be redrawn for the future. And like in the North Carolina case, the court was relatively clear that they were saying, even though we're not going to weaken voting rights in this particular case, we are still leaving the door open to do that in the future. And we are inviting more anti-voting rights politicians and lawyers to bring us more cases and more opportunities in the future to do the kind of thing we considered doing in this case, but didn't. And it's worth keeping in mind as we think about these two cases in which the court decided to consider doing something terrible and then ended up not doing it, that this is still 1 year after they overturned Roe v. Wade. And in theory, things like that are not supposed to impact the way that justices make their decisions. They're supposed to be just following the law. But the court is also a political institution, and they understand that they only want to incur so much backlash so frequently. And so there have also been other terrible decisions, right? Last year, there was a big decision rolling back EPA authority on climate. This year, 2 months ago, back in May, there was a big decision that severely limited the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act and took away protections for more than half the wetlands in the United States. But those are things that don't always get quite as much public attention as they should, whereas some of these decisions, like the one on abortion rights, do. And so I think it is fair to say that while in these two cases, the North Carolina case and the Alabama case, the court considered doing a bad thing, ended up not doing it, it doesn't mean we're out of the woods, either now or going forward.
Yep, absolutely. So very quickly, what do these rulings mean for 2024 and beyond?
So in a narrow sense, what they mean for 2024 is that there will be more wrangling about the congressional maps in a number of states. Certainly Alabama and North Carolina and some others that are, have related issues. But I think the big picture here is that there will be more opportunities for federal courts, including the United States Supreme Court, which has a 6-3 conservative majority right now, to intervene in election law ahead of the 2024 election and beyond. And there are essentially two big ways they can do that. One is through traditional, what's known as merits cases. They can grant cert, they can agree to hear a case from a lower court and put it on their docket and say, we're going to have a full briefing and lots of filings and oral arguments, and we're going to take months to consider it and then make a decision. That's one way they can do it. But the other thing that we should be on the lookout is what's increasingly known as the shadow docket. And this is essentially a process by which the Supreme Court can have quicker, less reasoned, often easier, frankly, interventions in cases that are moving through the lower courts. And it is another vehicle by which they are able to exercise the extraordinary power given to the Supreme Court, the most powerful court in the world, the U.S. Supreme Court. And the shadow docket allows them to intervene in more cases, more quickly, more frequently. And there are sometimes good reasons for them to use the shadow docket for certain things. But we are seeing it increasingly used for big controversial things that can have big policy or political impacts, more than we ever have before in these last few years, since there has been a 6-3 conservative supermajority. And so it is difficult to predict what the court will do in the 2024 election, but it is fair to assume that they will continue to be relevant to the conduct of the 2024 election in many states, and also that their intervention or their involvement will be, in many cases, sort of neutral in terms of its policy impact, like we saw in these, or negative. I would not expect them to be doing much to proactively protect voting rights or enhance protections for voting rights. I think it's just really important that we get out and have an overwhelming turnout for climate champions and democracy champions in the election, so that it no longer falls to the courts to have to protect our democracy when folks in the elected branches are not doing it. Right. And of course, we need good judges too.
Of course, all of the above, but we also have the power to do it ourselves and hold people accountable. Yes. Well, thank you so much, Doug. We really appreciate it. It was a fascinating conversation and on a really important topic. And we really appreciate you joining us on Climate Voters tonight.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Peter.
All right, bye.
Bye.
All right, moving on. Now we're going to turn to the EPA's recently proposed climate pollution standards for new and existing power plants. Coal and gas-fired power plants are one of the largest sources of climate pollution in the United States. They are responsible for about 1/4 of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and they pump out other smog-forming and toxic pollutants. We know that reliable, pollution-free energy solutions are available now. The Inflation Reduction Act is accelerating the availability of clean energy options. Last year, electricity generated from renewable energy surpassed coal-fired energy production for the first time ever, according to a report from the Energy Information Administration. So it's easier and more affordable now than ever to transition to clean energy, all while creating good-paying green jobs. Well, the EPA's proposed standards will deliver climate and public health benefits and protect people from the devastating impacts of climate change. Reducing pollution from power plants is an important step in the right direction for our country and our communities. And now for the action opportunity. The EPA is currently requesting public comment on these new standards, and that's where you come in. It's critical to make your voice heard and express your support for reducing climate pollution. The EPA reviews every single comment submitted before they finalize the standard. You can submit a comment today by visiting edfaction.org/powerplants. Our quick and easy tool allows you to submit an online comment directly to the agency in just a few minutes. Check out the link in the chat and on screen to take action now. Last, we're going to play a video from a recent virtual EDF Action event. We had some great speakers from Consumer Reports and Rewiring America who joined us to break down the consumer benefits of President Biden's clean energy plan. So, same credit waiting for you. All right, let's roll the video.
Much for joining us today for a discussion on the consumer benefits of President Biden's clean energy plan. So you might be wondering, what's President Biden's clean energy plan? It's the combined investments from the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed last year. These bills have enormous impacts for our community, but many folks aren't aware of how the provisions within them can save money on energy costs and benefit us all as consumers. So that's why we're here today. We're going to hear from experts on the electric vehicle tax incentives, rebates, and home energy benefits that help you and your family lead a more sustainable lifestyle and save money. So first question goes to Chris. Let's talk about clean transportation. What do our viewers need to know about the electric vehicle tax credits and the Inflation Reduction Act?
So the Inflation Reduction Act extended federal tax credits for electric vehicles of up to $7,500 through 2032. Previously, those tax credits expired for automakers that sold popular EVs. And so this really gives consumers another almost 10 years of tax credits on buying an EV. In addition, it added an up to $4,000 tax credit on used EVs. So this is a really important equity provision in this law that allows not just people who buy a brand new EV to save money, but also consumers who buy a used EV. So this will really help consumers. One, it will help consumers buy electric vehicles, which can save anywhere from around $1,500 to $2,000 a year in fuel and maintenance costs. Bring down that cost barrier to get into those electric vehicles that can really save money over time as you own the vehicle.
Sage, can you talk a bit about the energy efficient home and residential clean energy credits within the Inflation Reduction Act?
Thanks, Seal. I'd be happy to. As you say, there's sort of two flavors of the tax credit. The first is for the bigger purchases, so your solar, battery storage, and geothermal heat systems. You can get 30% off of all of those purchases. And if you don't have enough tax, you're not going to owe that much in tax in 1 year. You can also carry that amount forward into later years, so you can get that tax credit spread out over multiple years if you need to. The other side is the more energy efficiency focused. And those pieces, you can get $2,000 for 30% up to $2,000 for a heat pump to heat and cool your home, or for a heat pump water heater to heat and cool your water. And you can also get $1,200 in addition for things like insulation, or if you need to do wiring, like panel upgrades, or you need to do other sorts of air sealing and things. You can get a little money for new windows or new doors, all those sorts of things that can help make your house more energy efficient and help to lower your bills and make it more comfortable while you're in your home.
We have a question from Steve about heat pumps. Sage, can you talk a bit more about what a heat pump is and why it's a cost-effective option for homeowners?
So basically what a heat pump is an air conditioner that can go in reverse. So it both heats and cools your house. If you've ever noticed that behind your refrigerator, it gets kind of hot. And if you're like me, it also maybe gets a little dusty. But the fact that it's getting hot, the reason that is because it's also a heat pump. And what it's doing is just taking the heat from inside the refrigerator and dumping it out the back. So what a heat pump does, what we call the heat pump for your whole house, is just in the winter, it's taking heat from the outside and pulling it in and using that to heat your home. And in the summer, it's taking the heat out and dumping it outside, just like your regular air conditioner would. So they're great devices. For one, you only have to have one piece of equipment to do both your heating and your cooling. You don't have to have a separate furnace. Also, you don't have to be burning fossil fuels in your home. You don't have to worry about the climate impacts of that or the air quality impacts of that. As for the incentives, the tax credits are live now. So you can get $2,000 off if you get an energy efficient heat pump. Or an energy efficient heat pump water heater. There are additional incentives that will be coming online maybe around the end of this year or sometime into next year. Those are the rebate programs, and those are going to be run at the state level. So it'll be a little bit up to each state to see exactly what that timeline is going to look like. But that will have a higher incentive level, especially for low and moderate income families who just need a little bit extra help to be able to afford that equipment.
So there's so many options for home and transportation savings in the IRA. How should people evaluate which options are best for them and their families? Sage, can you talk to us more about rewiring America's savings calculator? Sorry.
Sure, no problem. We have an IRA calculator that's focused on the benefits that came from the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a lot of different pieces, and they all come with their own sort of rules and regulations. So the idea of the calculator is to try to take a little bit of personal information to create your own personal response. So depending on where you live, what your household income is, things like this, we can more tailor what might be applicable for your household.
Wow. All right. That was quite the jam-packed episode. I do apologize for going over time. We actually ended up doing pretty much a full 30-minute TV episode. So thank you so much for your attention and for tuning in. The good news is that we are going to be back to our bi-weekly schedule. I'll see you right here on August 3rd for another Climate Voters Tonight. You can always sign up for future episodes at the link in the comments. See you next time. And as always, Climate Voters Unite.